In this video, we're going to take a look at the data management project that has been built in Vue using parent-child communication. Now, the main idea behind parent-child communication is that there is going to be one parent component that will hold all of the other child components within it. Now, why not just have one giant component? Because it's a bad design. It's hard to be flexible with something when you have everything in one giant component. You can't think of it as you're building an application and then you're done, right? You're going to be going back to it. You're going to be updating it. You're going to be adding new stuff to it. So it needs to be flexible. It needs to be broken down into discrete little pieces. So even though we have generally one component that's handling everything, you also really want to break out the functionality of this application, of your application, into multiple components. But that's kind of a talk for another time. What we're going to talk about today is this data management application, this book search that we have, we're going to use in this parent-child communication fashion. And so here's the application up again. This is out there in the GitLab, which I will link to, and you can take a look at the code yourself. You can pull it in the code sandbox like I've done here, and we can take a look at how this application works. So like any Vue application, we will start at main.js. Main.js here is pretty simple. We are creating our parent component. So the parent component that runs the entire application, and then we render that into this app div, which you can find if you open up public and take a look at the index. We have our little app div here. So basically creates that component and shoves it onto this page. So really where our application kicks off, fundamentally for our code, is going to be in this parent.vue component. So let's take a look at that. So the parent.vue component, essentially what it does is it just creates the children that will live underneath it and then wires them up. Like, if you ever saw those old videos of the telephone operators that are like plugging wires in everywhere, right? We're wiring up the different components to the data that the parent has control over. So you'll see down here, we have the data being a book list. And there's also a piece of data called selected book. So if someone clicks on a book, we want to set selected book to something so that we can show the details for it. It also is in charge of calling the API. So it imports the API object that we created as a service, and this parent application is what calls that to get data. When new data comes in for a query, it calls that information to get new results and puts it into the book list. So this parent is here essentially as a controller. It's the switchboard operator for the entire application. It's here to give the children the data they need, and then to listen for child events to see what it might need to do as far as functionality for this application. So we have three different components on here that this parent has a controller or has control of, which is the book search, the book tiles, and the book detail, which I talked about before. The book search is a search box at the top. The user can type something in there, hit submit, and that will alert this parent component to go and do the search using the API. It then brings back that detail, throws it into the book list, and that's where book tiles comes in. So tiles is wired up to the book list. When the book list populates, tiles then get populated on the screen. If one of those tiles gets clicked, that then goes back up to the parent to let it know that something has happened with a certain book being selected. So then the parent will set that selected book, which will then trigger the book detail component to show on the screen and show the details for the book. And we can see that up here by looking at the components. With a parent-child type of architecture, it's very clear in the parent generally what is going on. So the book search, here we are listening for an event from that child. If a new search query is set, then we are going to perform that search within the parent. A perform search is down here where we actually call the API service, pass it the new query, and get back a list of books, which we then set to the parent's book list data object. The book tiles we are binding the book list to this child. So we're basically passing that data down to this child. And then we're listening on this to a book being selected. So when a book is clicked in the tiles, that will trigger a book selected method, which will pass us back the book. So tiles will actually tell us which book was selected, and we set that into our selected book. We then have the book detail is a component that we will give the selected book to, and we only show it if there is a selected book. If there's not a selected book, we just take it off the screen and it doesn't exist. And so we are giving the detail whatever book was selected, and that component, that child component, will let us know when to remove the selected book. So if the detail is closed, the closed button is clicked, the parent will then run this remove selected book, which will nullify the book here, which will then, of course, because of this if, will then collapse that detail and get rid of that component again. So this, you can see all of the like real functionality of the site to a great extent is housed here in this parent. The parent needs to know all of the data, and it actually controls all of the data. No child controls application-wide data. Now, some of these, like in the book search we'll look at, there might be component-specific data, but if there's data that needs to be used in the application as a whole or in other components, that first has to go back up to the parent, and the parent will pass that back down to a child. And so this creates like one-way channels. So for instance, like the book tiles, we have, we're binding these books to the book list. That means that there is a prop on the book tiles, which we can take a look at if we open up our components. So on book tiles, it has props, which is books, right? That's what's being bound here with the parent component. So books, so we're saying, okay, set the props on book tiles to this book list. Now that doesn't mean, like, that doesn't give book tiles access to that data to be able to change it the way it wants to, because it's coming in as a prop. It should not be changed by that child at all. It shouldn't even be touched, just read only. That's it. Which is not enforced in Vue, by the way. You could change that data and Vue will kind of like muddle along and be okay with it. But you really shouldn't do that. Don't ever do that. If it comes in as a prop, that means somebody else owns that data and you don't change it. But if you do need to do something with that data, you can emit an event back up to the parent, and then that parent will change something with that information. So let's take a look at book search. So if we open up book search, you can see we have this form that when the form is submitted, it calls this perform search. We have a box that's a query. We have a V model that's a search query. And then we have our submit button. And that's the basic UI for this. If we look down here, we have data. So this component does have data, but it is data that it uses internally only. And if that data ever changes, so if this form is submitted, then we will emit an event called new search query, and that will then pass that data up to the parent. And then the parent does whatever it wants to do with it. So this is a pretty simple component, right? It's kind of a basic UI component. You're going to find that a lot of your child components are fairly simple. They don't do a whole lot. They kind of like take data, they might interact with the user a little bit, and then they emit events. And they don't necessarily have a lot of logic housed within them. A lot of that is going to live in the parent component because the parent component controls the data. So when that gets emitted, the new search query is then caught here, and the perform search is done, which then calls the Open Library API service to actually do the search. That brings back a list of books, and the list of books is then set within this parent component's data. So the next is the book tiles, which is tied to that book list. So when that book list updates, this will immediately get updated within the props of the book tiles once that returns. So the book tiles basically goes through and says, okay, I'm getting books as a prop. So for each book in books, then we're going to create a book tile component. So a book tile component is a child of the book tiles component, but again is also being passed data as a prop for what book they're doing. And if a book is clicked on within that book tile, it will emit an event called select book. And what that looks like, if we go over here, this actually shows the book in the little tile, and if it's clicked on at all, then it calls that select book. Here you can see we're importing this API service, but that's just to get the URL for a book. Because that API knows how to do that, then we'll just import it here also and do that. So a book is coming in as a prop. We will emit this select book and actually tell them, okay, the book that I have is the book that was selected. And so we pass that back up. Those events do not bubble at all. They don't propagate up to other parents. So if that data lives in the parent, a child is given the array of books, which then it creates a child for each one of those books. So if an event is triggered down here, it has to be re-triggered here in order to get to the actual parent. And so this had to be put in order to basically do that bubble propagation that you would expect from something like a DOM event. But in Vue, those do not actually propagate. And so you have to manually do that in order to send it back up. And so you can see here, this is like the start of maybe a code smell of like, oh, this could get really complicated, right? If you have a hierarchy of children, then you really have to manage which events are going where and like how far up the chain they're going. It's very obvious where the event is going. It's going to the parent of whatever it was. But if you have a lot of children down there and this one throws an event that you need to get up here, you have to have everything redoing that and rethrowing those events. You could probably do that potentially with some mix-in to do it automatically. I do think there is a line of code that you can put in to have it happen automatically, but then picking out certain ones to do on their own is a little bit complicated. I might dive into that if anyone cares, but it's not something I've really run into a whole lot, so I haven't really used it too much. So this will, of course, re-emit that event so that it can get to the parent to let the parent know that a book has been selected. Once that happens, then we set whatever book we got back because it was put into the event. Whatever book we get back, we've set it as a selected book, and that then will turn on the book detail. And this essentially just shows information for the book. And because that VIF is in the parent and the parent is managing the selected book, that means that this component itself, it opens up a modal, but it cannot close itself. It has to ask the parent to close it. And so we have this close detail. We have a close link on here, a little button, that when it's clicked on, calls close detail. That then basically just tells the parent, hey, close detail event, like close whatever is showing as the detail, basically close me. And so the way the parent does that is it takes that event, sets the selected book to null, so sets it back to being nothing. That then triggers the VIF to turn off this component, and that component is taken out of the DOM and destroyed. So this is how all this is working. You can see that the more components you have, the more complex this parent component is going to be. And, that could get very unwieldy after a while, especially if you have a lot of stuff going on. And if you really do have a lot of data, none of these components have their own piece of this data, right? They're all being wired in. Someone hooked up this wire to here, listen for this event on this thing, do this when that happens. And the parent component can get very, very large as it essentially begins to hold the entire logic of the application. Everything else ends up being just like a UI element that shows things, and when something happens, it delegates everything off to somebody else, to the parent. So this can get really unwieldy after a while, especially if you have a whole lot of things going on. Even in this, there's a lot of, there's not a lot of lines of logic here, but if we were doing more than just a book search, you could add a new book, you could delete books, all of that logic then, if the parent component is the one talking to the API, all of that logic ends up living in the parent. And that can get very big, very fast. So that's the general view of parent-child communication within Vue. I think this is something that can work in a small scale on a bigger application where you might have a parent that just manages a couple of UI elements within itself. And on a small scale, this works really well. If you actually try to do an entire application this way, it would probably get, too crazy too fast. So next time, I'm hoping to talk about the event bus model of this. Again, it's the same application as this. It functions exactly the same as far as the UI, but we can take a look and see how that's built and how it acts differently than what we have here.